Chapter 6. God is Read. The Concept of History. One of the major distinctions that can be made between the tribal religions taken as a group and the Christian religion that underlies Western secular thought is the extent to which the two views were dependent on the idea of history. The Western preoccupation with history and chronological description of reality was not a dominant factor in any tribal conception of either time or history. Indian tribes had little use for recording past events. The idea of keeping a careful chronological record of events never seemed to impress the greater number of tribes of the continent. While the Indians who lived in Central America had extensive calendars, the practice of recording history was not a popular one further north. The way I heard it, or it was it was a long time ago, usually prefaces any Indian account of past tribal experience, indicating that the story itself is important, not its precise chronological location. That is not to say that Indian tribes deliberately avoided chronology. In post-discovery times, some tribes adopted the idea of recording specific sequences of time as a means of remembering the community's immediate past experiences. The best-known method of recording these experiences was the winter count of the Plains Indians. A large animal hide, usually buffalo, would be specially tanned, and each year a figure or symbol illustrating the most memorable event experienced by the community would be painted on the hide. Gradually, the hide became filled with representations of the years, and it would be maintained as long as there were people who could remember what the figures and symbols meant. One could not find a very accurate concept of history in the winter counts. In general, they indicated the physic life of the community, what was important to that group of people as a group. The chances of a continuous subject matter appearing on a winter count were nil. One year might be remembered as the year that horses came to the people. The next year might be the year when the berries were extremely large. The year after, perhaps the tribe might have made peace with an enemy or visited a strange river on its migrations. The chances of a series of political or military events being recorded year after year, as in the Western concept of history, was so remote as to preclude the origination of history as a subject matter of importance. One recent Siao winter count, for example, does not mention a number of important treaties, and one does not even mention the battle with Custer. Other tribes devised methods of recording community experiences similar to the winter counts. The Paimas and Tohono O'odhams of Arizona had calendar sticks on which symbols they were carved. By remembering what the symbols represented, a reader could recite a short chronology of recent years. But again, the ability of the reader limited the extent to which the history could be recorded. Some Indian accounts involved progenious memories, and recitations of events could take weeks of ceremonial storytelling. The Delaware, in post-discovery times, created a long chronology that had many political references, called the Walum Alum. It mentioned the tribes immediately bordering the Delawares, with whom they shared a general political fate. In this sense, the Walum Olum can be said to be more complex than the Siao and the Paima Tahano O'Donoham systems. However, the accuracy of Western European recounting and recording events was a distant goal for the most history conscious of the American Indian tribes. Lacking a sense of rigid chronology, most tribal religions did not base their validity on any specific incident dividing human time experience into a before and after. No Indian tribal religion was dependent on their belief that a certain thing had happened in the past that required uncritical belief in the occurrence of the event. Creation, gifts of powers and medicines, traumatic events, and the lives of great religious leaders were either events of the distant past and regarded as such, or the memories of the tribe were still vivid and occupied a prominent place in the people's perspective and understanding of their situation. Salvation and religious participation in communal ceremonies did not depend on the historical validity of the event, but on the ceremonies and powers that were given to the people in the event. Culture heroes were plentiful in the tribes. Daganowida founded the Iroquois League sometime in the pre-discovery days. Iroquois religion and politics did not revolve around him in the traditional Western religious sense, but the great law of the Iroquois held the major position in tribal religious and political life. Sweet Medicine, the Cheyenne religious figure, was believed to have received his powers in historical times, but the ceremonies he brought were important, not Sweet Medicine himself. The story of the white buffalo calf woman of the Sioux happened in the distant past. The importance in the story was the reception of the sacred pipe, not the woman herself as a personal object of salvation or adoration. The tribal religions had one great benefit other religions did not have and could not have. They had no religious controversy within their communities because everyone shared a common historical experience, and cultural identity was not separated into religious, economic, sociological, political, and military spheres. It was never a case, therefore, of having to believe in certain things to sustain a tribal religion. One simply believed the stories of the elders, and these stories had significance as defining the people's identity. Today, we can say they have specific themes, but that is our interpretation and not the way the people originally understood them. No tribe, however, asserted its history as having primacy over the accounts of any other tribe. As we have seen, the recitation of stories by different peoples was regarded as a social event embodying civility. Differing tribal accounts were given credence, because it was not a matter of trying to establish power over others to claim absolute truth. To be sure, tribes that had fallen under the wide-ranging military power of the various confederacies were reminded who ran things. Under the Iroquois and Creek alliances, weaker allies had no doubt about who was in charge. But there was no coercion to convert the smaller tribes to an Iroquois or Creek conception of past historical events and their efficacy. In the turbulent period of conflict with the whites, speeches recorded at treaty session statements made to the President of the United States to remind him of previous promises, and other statements of historical importance made use of chronological references. But one cannot say, on the basis of these speeches, that a fascination with historical reality was developed through contact with whites. Rather, the speeches reflect negotiations and arguments over specific proposals made by the U.S. representatives. Perhaps the best articulation of an Indian theory of history is found in the great speech by Chief Seattle at the signing of the Medicine Creek Treaty in Washington Territory in 1854. Recognizing that the loss of lands and establishment of reservations doomed his people, the Duwamish, Seattle sadly remarked as follows: "It matters little where quote, it matters little where we pass the remnant of our days. They will not be many. A few more moons, a few more winters, and not one of the descendants of the mighty hosts that once moved over this broad land or lived in happy homes, protected by the Great Spirit, will remain to mourn over the graves of a people once more powerful and hopeful than yours. But why should I mourn at the untimely fate of my people? Tribe follows tribe, nation follows nation. Like the waves of the sea, it is the order of nature, and regret is useless. Your time of decay may be distant, but it will surely come, for even the white man whose God walked and talked with him as friend with friend cannot be exempted from the common destiny. We may be brothers after all. We shall see. End quote. Seattle's theory of history may be much more a recognition of life's cynical nature than a statement of historical process. For many tribal religions, the distinction would be irrelevant. The recognition of growth and decay as limiting factors in a tribe's or nation's existence is worthy of note. It runs contrary to the Western European conceptions of the heavenly city and the thousand-year Reich. The idea of world ages, held by some tribes, is comparable in many ways to the world age concepts held by people in India. The flood stories, even the most remote, gave rise to the belief that the world is periodically destroyed by flood, fire, or other natural catastrophes, and this idea was held by a number of tribes with stories of some antiquity. Some substance was given to the belief in periodic destruction by particular stories, and in this sense the people could be said to have had a conception of history. For example, the Siao explanation was framed in familiar terminology. They held that the world was protected by a huge buffalo that stood at the western gate of the universe and held back the waters that periodically flooded the world. Every year the buffalo lost a hair on one of its legs. Every age it lost a leg. When the buffalo had lost all its legs and was no longer able to hold back the waters, the world was flooded and renewed. The Hopi had the most comprehensive understanding of world ages, as Frank Waters and White Bear recount in The Book of the Hopi. These people believed that they had survived three world destructions, and that each world had been marked by peculiar circumstances. Before each destruction, they were given special instructions for survival. And as each new world began, they received songs and ceremonies designed for living in the new world. Their ceremonial life would end with each world destruction. Other tribes had legends of similar content, although a great many tribes now appear to have had prophecies about the whites that have been so garbled and popularized as to confuse efforts to come to any conclusions as to which stories were quasi-histories and which were real prophecies. Suffice it to say, even the closest approach to the Western idea of history by an Indian tribe was yet a goodly distance from Western historical conceptions. What appears to have survived as a tribal conception of history almost everywhere was the description of conditions under which the people lived and the location in which they lived. Migrations from one place to another were phrased in terms of descriptive of why they moved. Exactly when they moved was, again, a long time ago. The scholars have had a difficult time piecing together the maps of pre-discovery America because of the vague nature of tribal remembrances. The Iroquois, for example, relate that they once lived on the plains but then migrated eastward. When is not important to them, but their relative hardship on the plains and eventual prosperity in the east are important. The result of this casual attitude toward history was, of course, that history had virtually no place in the religious life of the tribe. The appearance of the various folk heroes who brought sacred ceremonies and medicines could often not be located in time at all. Only recent and specific events, such as the Cheyennes' loss of some of their sacred arrows to the Pawnees, were remembered and formed a conjunction of history and religion. But the ceremonies, beliefs, and great religious events of the tribes were distinct from history. They did not depend on history for their verification. If they worked for the community in the present, that was sufficient evidence of their validity. In theory, it is entirely possible to construct a chronological history of a tribe. This task would be accomplished by knowing the sacred places within the tribe's geography and all of the stories that are related to these places. By identifying the before and after of the stories and then arranging them on a time scale, one could project a chronology. Some exceedingly wise people in some tribes can perform this function reasonably well, and some years ago the White Mountain Apaches began to develop historical atlas of their lands that had something of this flavor. In effect, the Book of the Hopi is a reconstruction of a basic Hopi chronology as defined by the migrations and locations that the people remember. In contrast, Christianity has always placed a major emphasis on the idea of history. From the very beginning of the religion, it has been the Christian contention that the experiences of humankind could be recorded in a linear fashion. And when this was done, the whole purpose of the creation event became clear, explaining not only the history of human societies, but also revealing the nature of the end of the world and the existence of heaven, or a future world into which the faithful would be welcome. Again, we have a familiar distinction. Time is regarded as all important by Christians, and it has a casual importance, if any, among the tribal peoples. The contrast between tribal religions and the Christian religion, therefore, can be made painfully clear with a brief and general sketch of the Christian religion itself. In a real sense, the Christian religion can be said to be dependent on the historical accuracy of the Hebrew religion, as found in the sacred books of the Jews. After the death of Jesus, the remaining disciples began to preach the doctrine that his crucifixion had been more than a simple execution. It was regarded by them as the culminating event in a direct sequence of events going back to the creation of the universe. We have already seen in chapter 5 how Paul made the connection between a historical man, Adam, and the historical man, Jesus, in such a way as to explain how the disobedience of Adam had been cancelled with the death of Jesus. It was within the recorded experience of the Hebrew people and the remnant peoples of the tribe of Judah, then known as the Jews, that the Christian innovation of world history took place. Two of the Gospels written to interpret the life of Jesus and his teachings had as their introductory remarks genealogies of Jesus, purporting to trace his ancestry back to Adam. That they are different is cause to wonder if a biological history of his family is the intent. If it is not accurate genetics, what is it? At any rate, the events of the Old Testament were seen as actual events of history, in which a divine purpose was gradually unfolding. The idea had been inherent in Jewish religious circles prior to the advent of Christianity, but with the missionary explosion of the Christian religion, the events could be said to have taken on cosmic significance for believers of the new religion. For some time before the lifetime of Jesus, Jewish theological circles had seen the development of a curious type of literature. A large body of literature purporting to have been written by the major folk heroes of the Hebrew past began to surface, and its concern with predictions about the end of the world and the salvation of the Jews appeared to be a common feature. Such writings were called apocalyptic writings, and it is from these sources, perhaps more than any other, that we derive the Christian idea of a divine purpose and a history and a subsequent fascination by Westerners for history. The religion that took form around the person of Jesus came to regard the events of the past as directly prefiguring his life and teachings. To arrive at such consequences, the books of the Old Testament were scoured for verses that might be interpreted as predicting certain events of his life. What we have in the four Gospels, therefore, is a curious mixture of historical events, parabolic teachings, and tortured proof texts from various sources in the Jewish writings. At best, the Gospels, which can be said to be the first Christian effort to define the meaning of past events in terms of humankind's universal history, are exactly that, tortured. The immediate followers, who had known Jesus, had come to the conclusion, apparently nurtured by Jesus himself, that their Lord would return within their own lifetime to restore the kingdom of Israel to the glory known during the eras of David and Solomon. So impending was this feeling that the original commune in Jerusalem headed by Jesus' brother James the Just, felt no desire or need to gather worldly goods. As a result, they were soon bankrupt, and one of Paul's first acts was to take up collections from converts to bail them out of their financial difficulties. The whole basis for the Christian belief in life after death was the alleged resurrection of Jesus after he had been dead for 3 days and his subsequent ascension into heaven. As the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles were written, there can be little doubt that the primitive Christian community wished its converts to believe that Jesus in his physical body had risen upward to heaven in a cloud. Early converts saw visions in which he returned on the clouds. When Jesus failed to return within the lifetime of those who had been his closest associates, the religion should have folded. But as the original group grew smaller and the religion spread to Asia Minor, the initial prediction was continually modified so that while the basic idea had been an immediate conclusion to history through divine intervention, its immediacy gradually became symbolic, not historic. It is now nearly 2,000 years since Jesus lived and died, and there has been no return. New converts periodically become wildly enthusiastic about the impending return of Jesus, and evangelistic Christianity continuously phrases its message of mission and conversion in terms of a return of Jesus in the not too distant future. As the years have passed and certain milestones have been reached, Christianity has gone into traumas with the idea of imminent judgment. The arrival of the year 1000 was particularly disappointing for the thousands of people who sold their earthly goods and prepared to meet their Maker. When the crisis passed and the Western world returned to normal, apologists for the religion trotted out their favorite Bible verses, attempting to smooth over the downhearted. 1,000 years is but a day in thy sight, and other confronting verses were used to cover over the failure of Jesus to reappear. The Christian religion looks toward a spectacular end of the world as a time of judgment and thus an end of history. It is thus theologically an open-ended proposition because it can at any time promote the idea that the world is ending. When such an event fails to occur, the contentions can easily be retracted by resorting to philosophical warnings about the nature of time. Time thus becomes a dualistic concept for Christians. It is both divine and human. Prophecies given with respect to divine time are promptly cancelled by reference to human time and its distinction from divine time. The concept of history became a rather nebulous subject matter as Christianity continued to grow. The events of the Old Testament were regarded as actual historical events, and their miraculous nature was ascribed to divine intervention on behalf of the Hebrews. As the Old Testament came closer to the days of Jesus and the writings became closed to further prophecies, with Malachi the idea of divine intervention in human affairs also appeared to slacken. In the first several centuries of the Christian religion appear to have been filled with miraculous acts of God in direct assistance to the Christian martyrs. After several centuries, however, in this tendency ebbed, and with the establishment of the organizational church as a political power in the crumbling Roman Empire, Christianity adopted the temporary doctrine that Jesus had established a church to supervise the affairs of men until he decided to return. This condition of nearly total church control over the lives of people was strengthened during the centuries that followed, and for many centuries the political struggles of Western Europe had to have Christian approval to be considered valid. The Protestant Reformation was instrumental in breaking the control of the organized church structure over the political and economic life of Europe. And since that time, while the political structures have continued to expand their power, the relative influence of the church has declined. The original doctrines of Christian expansion, however, did not decline with the waning influence of the church organization. In the first several centuries of Christian existence, one of the most popular justifications for the failure of Jesus to return to earth was his alleged admonition to his disciples to preach the message of his life to all nations. Thus, a substantial portion of the Christians believed that until every nation had heard the message of Christianity, Jesus could not come. In almost every generation of Christians, there was somewhere a militant missionary force seeking to convert non Christian peoples, and this propensity to expand the religion's influence meant, in realistic terms, an expansion of control by the church structure over non Christian peoples. With the rise of secular governmental forms after the Protestant Reformation, the bitter competition between nations for lands in the newly discovered Western Hemisphere, and the very violent struggles between competing interpretations of the religion following the Reformation missionary activity was seen as an arm of national politics, and the national imperialistic movements were justified on the basis of bringing the Christian religion to the heathen. This attitude is covered more thoroughly in Chapter 15. What is more important for our purposes here is to note that as secular goals became more important, they were clothed in familiar terms of Western cultural attitudes, not in terms of religious reality. Christian theology also had a direct influence on the development of the manner in which Westerners conceived the nature of the world. In the development of Christian theology, the two Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, were highly influential. Both of their philosophical systems sought to bring order out of the chaos of the world. And as the two major theologians of Christian history, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, sought to reconcile Greek philosophy with Christian ideas of history. People in the West became accustomed to thinking of natural processes in terms of uniformity. In the popular mind of the Old Testament was filled with highly exciting supernatural events, while the story of humankind since the life of Jesus was filled with smaller miracles and lacked the spectacular nature of Old Testament happenings. Western history, as we now have it, has failed to shake off its original Christian presumptions. It has, in fact, extended its theory of uniformity to include Old Testament events, so that the history of humankind appears as a rather tedious story of the rise and fall of nation after nation, and the sequence in which world history has been written shows amazing parallels to the expansion of the Christian religion. China, with its history going back far beyond the days of Abraham, thus does not appear as a significant factor in the world history until it begins to have relations with the West. India, with even more ancient records, appears on the world scene only when the British decide to colonize it, despite its brief role as a conquest goal of Alexander the Great. We are faced today with a concept of world history that lacks even the most basic appreciation of the experiences of mankind as a whole. Unless other cultures and nations have some important relationship with the nations of Western Europe, they have little or no status in the interpretation of world history. Indeed, world history as presently conceived in the Christian nations is the story of the West's conquest of the remainder of the world and the subsequent rise to technological sophistication. Because we cannot understand humankind from a more profound point of view, we have in recent years fallen into a number of easily avoidable difficulties. The original thrust of Christians opposing pagans translated itself many times in Christian history, and shortly after the discovery of the New World, Christianity was thought to be opposed on the one hand to the societies of the New World, and on the other to the heretics of Europe. The peoples of the New World were virtually destroyed by the European invaders, at the same time that Europe was being ravaged by witch hunts, the Inquisition, and religious wars. The tendency of placing Christianity against social or political forms of man's secular existence continues to this day. After World War II, planetary history was seen as a struggle between godless communism and the chosen people of God, the Christian nations. At least part of the involvement of the United States in Southeast Asia was because of the influence of an unimportant figure in the Roman Catholic Church, Francis Cardinal Joseph J. Spellman, who sought to bolster the fortunes of the church and also subscribed to the good guys, bad guys interpretation of world events. Much of the misunderstanding of the role of the United States in post war worlds involves this tendency to reject the Russians because of their rejection of Christianity. A major task remains for Western man. He must quickly come to grips with the breadth of human experiences and understand these experiences from a world viewpoint, not simply a Western one. This shift will necessarily involve downgrading the ancient history of the Near East, thus serving to cut yet more subjective matter away from the Christian religion. Louis Leakey's discoveries concerning early humans in Africa would seem to indicate that we are reaching a point at which the history of the Old Testament must assume a rather minor importance in the whole scheme of development. In addition to surrendering the historical Adam and his successors, we must surrender the comfortable feeling that we can find direct line from ancient times to the modern world via the Christian religion. This involves, of course, giving up the claim by Christianity of its universal truth and validity. Already, the field of history appears to be reaching a crisis. Ancient history is taken much too casually today because it is assumed that whatever happened within human experiences could not be much different than the mythology that has grown up to explain the relics of history. We have an apparent computer of great sophistication at Stonehenge, England, and yet the traditional conceptions of life during the times when this massive structure was built continue to reflect the Western Christian idea that nothing of major importance occurred until the advent of Western culture and its religion. The experiences of the Hebrews do not really take precedence over the experiences of accomplishments of other peoples when viewed with an unadvanced eye. The world abounds with ruins of incredible proportions, relating hardly at all to the history of the Hebraic Christian peoples. Yet these ruins are passed off with casual and hardly credible explanations based on the old theory of uniformity, which projects that the past had to be experienced in the way in which we experience life today. The pyramids of Egypt are a case in point. In the popular mind of Western peoples, the pyramids were built a la Cecile B. DeMille, with thousands of slaves tugging the large vine ropes up inclines to make a final resting place for the pharaoh. That the only reference to slave labor in the Old Testament remotely connected with building involves the Hebrew slaves making mud bricks is difficult for the popular mind to assimilate. It is when we go to the scholarly mind that we find even greater confusion, so that our sense of human accomplishments and the meaning of history are hardly enhanced by even the best of our educated minds. Walter Fairservice, for example, rejects the concept of slave labor in pyramid building in his book, The Ancient Kingdoms of the Nile. Quote, "We know that there were few slaves because foreign conquests were at a minimum. The labor for the pyramids came from the peasant farmers who, at times of high Nile, were comparatively idle and could be used for public projects. In such cases they were maintained at government expense, which in view of the job to be done could not have been meager. The number of pyramids and the years it took to build each of them indicates that a stable arrangement between government responsibility and peasant labor had been established." End quote. The picture appears to be idyllic. In times of unemployment, the benevolent Pharaoh provided work for his people by having them put together what must certainly be among the most massive structures in history. But is this even a realistic picture of what happened in earlier times? That the U.S. government put forward the make work projects of the Great Depression years does not mean that the Pharaoh did likewise. The very bulk of the pyramids precludes Fairservice's solution to the problem. The Great Pyramid of Cheapos, for example, is incredible. Its base covers 13 acres, or 7 midtown blocks of the city of New York. From this broad area, leveled to within a fraction of an inch, more than 2.5 million blocks of limestone and granite, weighing from 2 to 70 tons apiece, rise in 201 stepped tiers to the height of a modern 40-story building. A construction project the size of this pyramid would have been a task of no mean proportions. Suppose that the workers had placed a minimum of 20 blocks of stone a day in the structure, a feat that would have been virtually impossible, yet still conceivable. Working steadily, they would have assembled the 2.5 million stone blocks in about 125,000 days, or 342 years. In this projection, we have still not accounted for cutting the blocks, carrying them down the Nile, and bringing them to the assembly place. And we have projected a straight working project, not a summertime government make work project as Fair Services and other scholars have assumed. If the Pilgrims had begun building a pyramid the size of the Pyramid of Cheops to celebrate their safe landing in America, they would have finished the project in 1962, perhaps just in time to receive a government grant to celebrate. Is the traditional interpretation of history really an exercise in credibility? At Aswan Dam in Egypt, the people of many nations worked to save four sandstone statues from an ancient temple from being destroyed by the waters of the dam. Engineers from nearly 100 nations pooled their talents to save these priceless treasures. They had the benefit of helicopters, the latest in hydraulic jacks, lifts, cranes, and other modern construction equipment. Yet they had to cut the statues into smaller pieces to move them a mere 60 feet above the waters. In a quarry near Baalbek in Asia Minor, the Hajar el Gobel stone lies squared and ready for removal. It weighs more than 4 million pounds, and primitive men are going to get their logs and ropes and move it. Hardly. The world is, as we have noted, literally strewn with ruins of overwhelming proportions, structures that we cannot duplicate today if we wished to do so. Yet the Western interpretation of world history is always skirting a straightforward effort to incorporate theories about the origin of these ruins and structures. We are fixed on a rather staid reading of human history because we are emotionally and religiously tied to the assumption, today, perhaps subconsciously at least, that everything is pretty much the way people once believed centuries ago. Even the relatively short time period of American history has been influenced by our religious heritage. There is sufficient evidence that this continent was visited by numerous expeditions prior to the arrival of Columbus. Pottery discovered in South America suggests fairly early contact between Japan and this hemisphere. Ruins in Massachusetts and Arizona may be evidence of early visits by Phoenicians and Romans. Yet, up to this time, scholars have adamantly refused to believe that any pre Columbian landing took place. Even the Viking ruins in Minnesota have been buffeted by tremendous criticism and the jeers of skeptics, while the Columbian primacy had prevailed. Cyrus Gordon, a noted scholar at Brandeis University, took a cautious stand in favor of pre-Columbian expeditions. In his book, Before Columbus, he documented two possible pre-Columbian visits to the New World. Gordon's courage in dealing with a controversial subject produced great fruits during the past 2 decades. Today, there are literally hundreds of books dealing with pre-Columbian expeditions to this continent, and many of them make a great deal of sense. The best writing is being done outside academic circles because it covers data and theories that are not regarded as orthodox, because they make uncomfortable the reigning elder statesmen of anthropology, archaeology, and history. The reluctance of scholars to consider the possibility of pre-Columbian visits to the Western Hemisphere is but one example of the stranglehold that the one interpretation of history has had. There is, to a certain extent, a political justification in refusing to accept pre-Columbian discoveries. The land title of the United States relates back to the famous doctrine of discovery, whereby Christian nations were allowed by the Pope to claim the discovered lands of non Christian peoples. To accept a series of pre Columbian visitations would mean that the lands of the Western Hemisphere were hardly discovered by Europeans. It would call into question the interpretations and justifications given to colonization, exploitation, and genocide committed by Europeans during the last 5 centuries. Christian religion and the Western idea of history are inseparable and mutually self supporting. To retrench the traditional concept of Western history at this point would mean to invalidate the justifications for conquering the Western Hemisphere. Americans, in some manner, will cling to the traditional idea that they suddenly came upon a vacant land on which they created the world's most affluent society. Not only is such an idea false, it is absurd. Yet without it, both Western man and his religion stand naked before the world. It is said that one cannot judge Christianity by the actions of secular Western man, but such a contention judges Westerners much too harshly. Where did Westerners get their ideas of divine right to conquest, of manifest destiny, of themselves as the vanguard of true civilization, if not from Christianity? Having tied itself to history and maintained that its God controlled that history, Christianity must accept the consequences of its past. Secular history is now out of control, and its influence has become a rather demonic, disruptive force among nations. This is part and parcel of the Christian religion. If the lack of a sense of history can be called shortcoming of tribal religions, as indeed it can, overemphasis on historic reality and its attendant consequences can certainly be assigned a bad grade for the Christian religion. End of chapter 6.